Thank you all for joining us today for the last of the spring series of Faculty Insights virtual seminars on COVID-19. We are going to be starting up again on May 26th with Ashwath Damodaran, who will be moderated by Viral Acharya. So stay tuned for more information on the weekly, it will go to weekly every Tuesday, summer sessions in this series. But for today, we have an issue to focus on, the effect of this pandemic on globalization that has been the object of much inquiry and discussion. And we have two of Stern's experts on globalization, Steve Altman and Rob Salomon, to discuss this with us. So Rob and Steve, thank you so much for participating. And I think Rob, take it away.
Thank you, Batia, and thanks to all of you for joining us today to discuss COVID-19 and globalization. Steve and I are delighted to be here. Steve Altman is a professor here at NYU Stern, where he also leads the NYU Stern Initiative on Globalization. I likewise am a professor here at Stern, where I've been researching globalization-related topics for the better part of the last 20 years. And so we're delighted to share our expertise in globalization with you. Before we get into the details of the presentation, I wanted to provide a bit of an agenda, just so to give you a sense for where we're going to go. So what we're going to focus on is at the beginning is globalization and the pre-pandemic trajectory, and we'll talk about what the pandemic has done to globalization and global activity in the short term. We'll provide also some forecasts. And then toward the end, what we'll do is get into a discussion of the longer run implications of this COVID-19 pandemic on globalization. We'll talk about the drivers of the future of globalization, and we'll touch also on the business implications. So one of the debates that we've seen on globalization over the past month or two is whether or not COVID-19 means the end of globalization. And there's been a divide here. On the one hand, you'll see headlines that say, oh, well, this is the end of globalization as we know it. As Forbes, just April 3rd, says the post-coronavirus world may be the end of globalization. And then there are others who take a more tempered view, suggesting that, well, globalization is not over. This is just a temporary blip. And we're going to address those issues in turn. Now, of course, I recognize that not everybody here is an expert in or familiar with globalization. And so let me just briefly provide some context for the purposes of level setting before we dive into the specific data. So when you think about globalization, I define globalization as the free or freer movement of goods, services, capital, ideas and knowledge, and people across borders. Now, that's sort of the theory or the idea behind globalization. Now, how do you measure it? And that's something that Steve has been working on for a long time. In particular, he's been working with DHL to develop what's referred to as the Global Connectedness Index, where they take the idea or that definition of globalization and try to measure those movements. And so they'll measure the movement of goods and services with trade flows, the movement of capital with capital flows, the movement of ideas and knowledge with information flows, and the movement of people with things like migration, tourism, students seeking education in other places. There's one thing that I will point out too about this, which is that, look, these flows sometimes capture some elements of each other. So for example, when you have students traveling to study in other countries, that also sometimes can reflect knowledge moving across borders, ideas, the sharing of information that is part of people mixing when they travel overseas. So again, this is, Steve has been working a long time with DHL on measuring these flows, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of that background. And also, before we dive into the data, there's one important thing to stress, that it probably will come as no surprise to many of you that the data we share today will reflect an obvious lurch downward in globalization activity. Now, it's one thing to talk about the amount of the decline in globalization, and another to talk about the extent of that decline. And so what do we mean by that? And by the extent of the decline, what I mean to say is how much global activity has declined relative to domestic activity, or how much has domestic activity substituted for what previously used to be global activity. And so wherever possible, we're going to try and focus on this latter part. To what extent has globalization dropped relative to other flows? And with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Steve Altman.
Thanks very much, Rob. And thanks also to Batia, to the rest of the team behind this series, and to all of you for joining us today. As Rob mentioned, the DHL Global Connectedness Index is calculated based on the 12 types of trade, capital, information, and people flows that are listed on the screen. Now, we don't have enough recent data on all of those flows to track COVID-19 impacts using the index itself, but I'll use the index to set the pre-pandemic context, and then we'll look at narrower sets of measures for the COVID-19 impacts. So here's the overall trend line on the full index from 2001 through 2018. And without going into details on how this is calculated, the main driver of this trend is changes in the proportion of international relative to domestic activity. So what Rob was talking about a moment ago with respect to the extent of globalization. So when international trade, capital, information, and people flows grow faster than their domestic counterparts, that pushes the index up. And when international flows lag behind domestic activity, that pulls the index back down. Now, what we were seeing before the pandemic was that globalization measured in this way was not advancing as swiftly or as steadily after the 2008 global financial crisis as it had been before the crisis. But we still observed that the world was more globalized in 2018 than at just about any previous point in history. So we were a bit off of the all-time high that we had measured, but we were still pretty close to it. And just going one layer deeper, the trade and capital flow pillars of the index are still below their pre-crisis peaks, while the information and people flow pillars of the index have continued to set new records. So to summarize the background context, the COVID pandemic has hit globalization after a period of slower and more volatile growth, particularly of trade and capital flows, but still at a time when most globalization measures remained close to their all-time highs. Now, moving along to the COVID-19 effects on international flows, let's look first at trade growth forecasts in volume terms. So in other words, just how much actual content moves across borders rather than the dollar value of that trade, and not yet the kind of extent measures that Rob was talking about a moment ago. So the WTO, the World Trade Organization, has prepared a range of forecasts depending on how long the pandemic lasts and the economic consequences. They predict a 13 to 32% drop in the volume of merchandise trade, that's trade in physical goods, in 2020. Under the more pessimistic case, a 32% drop would imply a faster collapse of world trade than even during the Great Depression. The latest IMF forecast, shown here on the right, covering both goods and services, predicts a smaller 11% decline in 2020, although the IMF also highlights downside risks to their forecasts. So current forecasts call for very large declines in trade volume in 2020. Now, at this point in the presentation, I would like to note the general pattern that when macroeconomic conditions deteriorate, trade and other kinds of international flows tend to shrink much faster than domestic activity. The WTO forecast assumes a 3 to 9% drop in real GDP, while the IMF forecast assumes a 3% decline. So both of these forecasts imply trade volume shrinking roughly 3 to 4 times faster than output. Now, having just shown you the worst trade volume forecast to come in since I started doing this type of work, I think it's useful to try even very roughly to gain some perspective on these forecasts by putting them in context, both with trade relative to overall economic activity and by looking across a long historical time period. So this chart looks across 2 centuries at one of the most commonly used measures of global market integration via trade, the global ratio of exports of goods and services to GDP. After very large increases since World War II, this metric peaked in 2008 and has been fluctuating below that peak over the past decade. For 2020, I'll put here an extremely rough estimate based on the IMF, generated based on the IMF forecast. And the reason that I have to hedge so much about this particular number is that it reflects both the uncertainty of how much trade volume we're going to have, as well as the fact that this calculation has to take into account price levels of traded goods and exchange rates. And as most of you would be familiar with, we've been seeing wild swings in the prices of some key traded commodities, such as oil. But as long as we recognize the caveats around this and that we can't be very sure yet where this number is going to land, I think it's helpful to see that at least calculations based on the data we have at this point would put the world exports to GDP ratio for 2020 back roughly to where it was in the mid-2000s. So that's a really huge drop, but the mid-2000s was hardly an era of disconnected national economies. Most of the run-up in trade integration after World War II would still stand even under that scenario in 2020, and the major forecasts all do still call for a rebound in 2021. Before moving on from trade to capital, I'm sure many of you are wondering about how to think of the effects of the US-China trade war versus those of the pandemic. In the preceding charts, you've already gotten some sense of this, but I'd like to dramatize how much larger the pandemic effect on trade growth is by showing you how the IMF trade forecasts have shifted as both of those episodes unfolded. So what we see here is forecasted trade volume growth year on year for 2018 through 2021, as it looked back in October 2018, still in the fairly early stages of the trade war. The forecast at that point called for roughly 4% growth in all 4 years, just a bit faster than real GDP growth. As the trade war unfolded, 2019 was downgraded repeatedly, but a rebound was still expected in 2020. Here's how it looked in April 2019, October 2019, and even January 2020. And then the pandemic hit. Here's the April 2020 forecast with a very steep drop in 2020 and then hope for a rebound in 2021. Let's move on then to capital flows, starting with the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD's latest forecast on foreign direct investment flows. FDI mainly reflects companies buying, building, or reinvesting in operations abroad. The latest forecast calls for a 30 to 40% decline in 2020/2021. That's another very striking forecast, but I'd like to mention 2 caveats about it. First is to note that FDI, like other capital flows, tends to be quite volatile. So a 30 to 40% decline here is not as surprising as a similar decline would be for a measure of trade, information, or people flows. Second, it's important to keep in mind that FDI flows are really not a great proxy for changes in the activity of multinational firms, such as their foreign production or foreign sales. So the FDI trend does not necessarily imply a real retreat from corporate globalization. From a capital flow perspective, what I'm actually more concerned about than the FDI trend is how 2020 is going to play out for emerging economies. Remittances, largely money that migrants working abroad send back home, are an even larger source of capital for emerging markets than FDI, and the new forecast from the World Bank predicts a 20% drop in 2020. At the same time, emerging markets have suffered record net outflows of portfolio investment, analysis by the Institute for International Finance shows that during the first 75 days of the COVID-19 crisis, net outflows of portfolio investment from emerging markets were more than 3 times larger than they were during the 2008 global financial crisis. Fortunately, those flows have stabilized over the past couple of weeks. Looking at full year projections for 2020, the Institute for International Finance forecasts that net portfolio flows to emerging markets, excluding China, will be negative for both equity and debt, but more sharply negative for portfolio equity. For information flows, the third of our 4 categories, we don't have updates yet for any of our usual annual data sets, but my rough impression of the data available thus far is that they point to large increases in data traffic, but not necessarily increases in the globalization of information flows. To show you how data traffic has soared during COVID-19, here are Cloudflare's estimates of the growth of internet traffic in 10 countries since December of last year. On average, internet traffic for those countries grew 42%. People are staying at home, working, watching videos, attending Zoom meetings and seminars like this one. But how much of that traffic is actually international versus domestic? We don't know yet. But I suspect a big part, for example, of the increase in online meetings actually reflects meetings between proximate participants who normally would have met in person. So we can't assume an increase in globalization just based on the growth of overall internet traffic. Online news represents another source of content on information flows. This chart shows the proportion of page views on major news websites from internet users located outside of the media outlet's home country. It shows January versus March for 3 countries hit hard by the pandemic, the US, Spain, and Italy. There isn't a clear pattern of large increases or decreases in the international share of readers on these news sites. So people are reading a lot more news during this period, but there doesn't appear to be a big shift toward or away from people relying on foreign news sources. In contrast, there's even some evidence that people might be reading more very local news. In the US, Patch.com's traffic appears to have grown more than CNN's during the pandemic. Finally, turning to people flows, international movements of people have largely ground to a halt. Scheduled airline capacity is down 90% for international flights, as compared to 62% for domestic flights, according to data from OAG. But even those numbers understate how bad the situation is for air travel, because they don't take into account how many empty seats the airlines are flying around or how many scheduled flights are being canceled. In the US, the number of people passing through TSA security checkpoints is down 95%. And here are a couple of forecasts for international travel over the full year of 2020. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, in the chart on the left side, is forecasting a tremendous 44 to 80% drop in international air passengers. And the UN World Tourism Organization on the right side is expecting a 20 to 30% drop in international tourist arrivals across all modes of transportation. And I wouldn't be surprised if the latter forecast gets revised downward. That UNWTO forecast was from March. Since it is people who carry the virus from one place to another, it seems likely that international travel will take longer than the other flows to recover. According to the UNWTO, we're now all the way up to 100% of countries having imposed travel restrictions due to the pandemic, and no countries have yet lifted those restrictions. To wrap this up, looking across the different categories of flows, I figured an interesting way to summarize the forecasts I've cited would be to look at how far back we have to go to see international flows similar to those that have been forecasted for 2020. In other words, how far back, roughly speaking, would 2020 turn the clock back on globalization if these forecasts come to fruition? For example, looking at the top bar, for merchandise trade, a 13 to 32% drop in trade volume would put that measure back to where it was between 2009 and 2013. There are several caveats, and this isn't very sophisticated, but looking down across this chart, all but 3 of the forecasts take us back to international flow levels from between 2009 and 2016. So big drops versus 2019, but generally not to levels that most business people haven't seen before earlier in their careers. And only the lower bound international air travel forecast would take us back below where we were in the mid-2000s. So in my view, the data that I've shared with you represent a tremendously painful setback for anyone whose business or livelihood depends on international flows. But as long as these drops are followed by a recovery rather than further declines, they wouldn't mean the end of globalization. Globalization's longer-term prospects, of course, are our next topic, for which I'll turn the presentation back over to Rob. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And I think now one of the questions that we can ask, like many who focus on the macro economy, as globalization scholars, we're also left wondering, what will a globalization recovery look like? Will it be a V? Will it be an L? Will it be a W? Or will it even recover fully, right? We could envision a world where globalization activity increases back from its lows where it stands right now, but only to settle at levels that are lower than what the pre-COVID peaks had been in 2016 and 2017. And depending on, a lot of what we believe about how globalization will take shape over the coming years depends on some very important issues. And so I have my own priors. I know what I think is going to happen with respect to globalization, but rather than just sort of give you my own sense or our own sense, we're happy to address that in the Q&A. I just wanted to frame the discussion. And more practically, I think the important thing is there some vaccine or effective treatment? And you obviously can imagine that with a vaccine or effective treatment, that levels of globalization will recover more quickly. Also, with a vaccine or effective treatment, we can think that reopening timelines and guidelines will allow us to go back to certain activities that we engaged in pre-COVID. Now, as a scholar of institutions, I actually like to think about how will the institutions, human-created institutions, respond to such a crisis? And we can think about sort of political regimes and the kinds of frictions and fragility that exist across the world, and the policy responses that they'll adopt in the face of this crisis. Right? The reality is we're already living in an environment of increased populism and nationalism. So the question is do these trends continue as a result of the coronavirus, or do they reverse? And I have to say, frankly, that I'm at maybe the most uncertain point that I've ever been in my career at this respect. In some sense, I'd say, ask me again on November 4th, because a lot of this will depend on what happens in the election in the United States and elsewhere throughout the globe. We could think about what this means about relations between superpowers, right? China, the US, and the blame game, and how politicians will respond to, especially when you think about the United States and Europe, how they will respond to China in a post-COVID world. And as Steve mentioned, you could think about political stability in emerging markets, especially those that are heavily reliant on the export of commodities or manufactured goods. You can think about economic policies that will be pursued by political administrations. You can ask about autarky versus interdependence. Will we want to go it alone in a post-COVID world? Or are we okay going back to pre-COVID arrangements? And you can think about supply chains, just the availability of things like PPE and ventilators. You can ask, and critical equipment that's needed to fight the pandemic. Right. So this has stoked sort of the redundancy versus reshoring debate. Should we be outsourcing the manufacture of critical goods to third countries? Or should we be reshoring that activity back and manufacturing those domestically? We'll ask questions about, do we want more immigration or less? And whether or not we want more immigrants, let's say, will immigrants, from a supply side standpoint, will immigrants still want to come? We can think about ongoing technological innovation and how people respond to this pandemic. How will people shift out the production possibility frontier? Will advances in robotics and machine learning make more reshoring possible, right? Further affecting the possible snapback in trade? Will advances in 5G technologies make remote work more reasonable, more desirable, and influence global flows? And then finally, you have to ask about public opinion. Globalization is often a boogeyman when it comes to blame for bad outcomes, economic and otherwise. And so we can wonder, how will attitudes change towards globalization? Will there be a rise in xenophobia? Will people not feel safe traveling? And something that's incredibly important for universities in particular, what will all of this mean for international students? Will students still want to come? Will students be allowed to come? And so I think when you're thinking longer term, you have to ask or wonder about the political, economic, and cultural institutions within countries and what the responses will be of those institutions to the crisis. Just to pepper this a little bit with my own personal view, I believe that we will see a rebound in globalization activity over the next 12 to 18 months. However, my expectation as of now is that we will settle at lower levels than the pre-COVID peak. And with that, we'll turn it over to questions and open it up from here.
Thank you so much, Rob and Steve, for the really interesting presentation. I think you guys really helped to put the COVID-19 implications for globalization in context, suggesting that when we consider what's going on domestically and we kind of factor that out of the flows that are international or global, that actually the picture looks a lot less bad than it appears when you're looking at sort of overall volume. I'm wondering, though, if you can give us a little bit of nuance in a couple of different ways. One of them is might the texture or sort of the places, the texture either regionally or at the industry level change as a function of the virus in ways that are maybe a little more irregular and maybe more dramatic than the overall numbers look. So, for example, we know that there was this trade war with China. There's been a lot of attention to supply chains being kind of fragile because they are too dependent on just a few players, and particularly a lot of talk of too great dependence on China in particular. And so I wonder if you see changes in the regional interdependencies coming out of coronavirus.
Steve, do you want to address that one first? And, I can jump in and chime in.
Sure, I could comment a bit. So I think it is quite likely that we're going to see more diversification of supply chain sourcing. So so you can think of, in terms of trying to respond, there's this debate that Rob mentioned of redundancy versus reshoring, and that most of the literature would suggest that a more redundant, more diversified set of foreign sources would be the safer way to proceed versus trying to work very, very heavily on reshoring. And so a lot of people take the next step from redundancy to more regionalization. I think it's too early to say. So there's been a lot of talk over the past few years of a shift toward more regionalization, the idea that globalization might be breaking down along regional lines. when we look at the trade data, we do not yet see a trend of shorter distance trade growing faster than longer distance trade. So we don't yet see the evidence in the overall trade data to say that it's clear that we have shifted toward a much more regionalized system. On the other hand, there are good reasons to think that it might happen given the nature of the political relationships and other considerations. So it's certainly a very strong possibility, but I would say not yet a foregone conclusion that we would see more regionalization coming out of this episode.
And what I would add to that is, so I largely agree with Steve. And as a student of institutions, what I would say is, as Steve was mentioning, what my work demonstrates is that as a response to this crisis, what you will likely see is increased trade and investment across countries that are more similar to each other. Right? You will probably see greater levels of regionalization between, say, the United States and the United Kingdom, the United States and Western Europe, and probably less of US and Europe with China for a variety of reasons related to how their institutions seem to be developing over time. Another thing that I wanted to comment on just briefly, which I think also Steve mentioned, was this notion of supply chains and redundancy versus reshoring. And I think that one thing that this COVID pandemic has really brought to the fore is risk management, something that I think people have underestimated for too long a period of time, which I think that we sort of, when you spoke to most folks about supply chains, they were happy to go with whoever had the lowest price without really taking into consideration that lower price might come with additional risk, and they tended to discount that risk. And so I would expect to see more reshoring, precisely because people now recognize the risk to offshoring in a way that before they overlooked.
So in a way, the two of you are suggesting almost opposing things. So you're kind of, whereas Steve sounded like he was talking about much more redundancy, you're suggesting that there's also going to be a shift to reshoring. And even when there is redundancy, it will be with countries that are more similar. And so maybe, that's kind of somewhere in between reshoring and redundancy.
If I could clarify a little bit on that point, what I would say is that there are good reasons to think that there will also be an increase in reshoring, and that it would depend on the political sensitivity of the industry. So in industries that are more politically sensitive, I think the balance would shift more toward reshoring. Where it's less politically sensitive, more redundancy is more likely, or some combination thereof.
So what we've seen, it was actually the thing that everyone is paying attention to is those industry differences. And for sure, the fact that we are dependent on external production, on global production for things like PPEs has gotten a lot of attention. But for a decade now, we have, at least a decade, we've been very concerned about reliance on pharmaceuticals coming from outside. And so the whole arena of pharmaceuticals and medical supply chains, that you're suggesting would be reshored. What do you, I'm sorry.
So I was just going to, you precisely nailed it, which is, I think in every industry, they're going to have to ask themselves, what is our version of PPE? What are those critical inputs that we can no longer just rely on external sourcing, where we would need to have some critical supply from either a third country or to reshore that and do that at home as well. So I think risk management in particular is going to be a bigger focus in a post-COVID pandemic world.
So the redundancy option, and then you're suggesting, that it would be within industries, that basically every industry is going to reshore some things, but is going to probably maintain global supply chains for the things that they still can. And though those might be a little more redundant. One of the promises of redundancy is the possibility of sharing the wealth. We know that globalization has been responsible for an overall lowering of economic inequality across countries and sort of distribution of opportunities. And that there are some countries that have benefited more. This effort at looking for where might redundancies, where might we sort of look for other options, that do you see that potentially being beneficial to developing countries, that they could be on the list of where we would look to have kind of backup supply chains and sort of alternative options to the bigger players? Or do you see it actually kind of increasing inequality, like the effort that Rob, you were highlighting, looking to countries that are more similar to us, that perhaps would go in the opposite direction?
Steve, if you don't mind, I'll jump in and turn it to you real quick. This is a really interesting thought exercise, because I think that one of the things that we have learned about globalization over the years is that it truly has helped increase the size of the overall pie, increase economic growth. And but the problem is that the distribution of those gains has been lopsided, to say the least. So if you look at the United States, some sectors of society have benefited from globalization much more so than others. If you look at sort of developing economies have benefited largely from globalization. In fact, some of the backlash, some of the nationalism and populism movements, to me, are more a backlash towards the uneven distribution of gains to globalization. That's part and parcel of what we've observed with the nationalism and protectionist movements. Now, the question is, if we go to a post-COVID world where, developed countries start reshoring things strategically, if they start, if they stop relying on developing countries for inputs, then that could be detrimental. And I'm especially worried about developing economies in a post-COVID world. Steve, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that it's kind of a double-edged sword. There will be probably a few countries that do benefit from becoming from growth as alternative suppliers relative to China, but overall the picture is concerning.
Yeah, I think that sort of on that, what we've seen is that COVID-19 has rapidly spread among the developed countries, and only now, sort of much later, has it begun to spread in developing countries, and it seems like the toll is just extraordinary. And so we expect that these countries, because of the state of their healthcare system, because of the state of their political dynamics, their ability to kind of come back into the global system and the comfort of the developed countries in sort of welcoming immigration flow back, doing business with those countries, could be much more delayed, could be a less rapid return. And so I guess, that's kind of a hypothesis. I wonder what you folks think, or have you thought about, or is there any data that might help us to address what you think the recovery process will look like globally?
With respect to the pandemic itself, I wouldn't consider myself an expert. So what were the effects from a public health standpoint, what the effects will be on developing economies versus developed economies. But I do think my hypothesis would align with yours, Batia, which is that my expectation is that developing countries would recover much more slowly than developed countries. And I'm especially worried about developing countries who are dependent upon specific commodities that have taken a beating over this. So those dependent, for example, on oil in particular. You can think about countries like that, who for them recovery will take a lot longer than it would sort of for developed countries or countries where the economies are more diversified. But I think that's it's a slightly different question than globalization flows. That's talking about comparing global economic activity across countries versus sort of the flows of the globalization flows themselves.
Okay, so some questions that have come from the audience, and I welcome others to post them. But Tom Pugel, our colleague in economics, is asking, how quickly and how well will we be able to see and measure changes in the use of these global supply chains?
It depends sort of how we're thinking about the supply chain. So if you want to be looking at sort of the extent, let's say, to which foreign inputs are going into production in different countries, these data really come out with quite a long lag. So we haven't been seeing the growth we used to in terms of more steps being added in supply chains, but it really will be quite a lag before we're going to be able to know sort of at that level of granularity how the supply chains are shifting. The overall data in terms of the trade, capital flows, the much bigger picture measures are coming in quickly. So we're looking at it month by month. China had surprisingly strong trade data for April, but I'm afraid that's probably going to be a blip. But so it varies across the different metrics. But in terms of the actual reconfiguration of supply chains, I think it will take us quite a bit longer to know what's really happening. You hear a lot of anecdotes, but it's hard to actually quantify what's happening in the aggregate.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, Tom, I know, Tom, this doesn't precisely answer your question. And, I defer to Steve, who has been measuring the supply chain and trade flow data for quite some time. But I think that something that will give you an indication of how just generally globalization flows will start to evolve is come September, when we see how foreign students are able to attend or not attend universities. And that will give us, I think, our first glimpse or our first indication of what the longer term, how long it will take for these globalization flows to change or to recover, let's say.
That's interesting because arguably the reason for the internationalization of education is the internationalization of business, of global activity, that basically people want to have these global educational experiences in order to prepare them for careers that they expect to be global. And what you're suggesting is that maybe it can go in the opposite direction. And certainly we know that the more experiences people have internationally, the more that they basically seek those out and help then drive global activity. But I think if people are making predictions, sort of in the short term, is it possible that basically students are thinking about the likelihood that they will be able to stay in the US for a job and using that as a decision determinant of where they want to get a degree from. So I guess it can go in both directions.
Right. And I would say that there are sort of two ways that you can think about sort of the student aspect of this. Is that one, you can think about this as at a policy level, which is, why do countries allow foreign students to come in and study? At least for the United States, part of that was to attract talent, and not only to attract talent, but to keep talent. So if you look, I think it's over the last 30 years or so, people who've come to study STEM subjects in the United States, foreigners who've come to study STEM subjects in the United States, 90% of them are still in the United States 10 years after their degree. Now, for individuals, the why, part of it is driven by, maybe I want to go to a place that has greener pastures, but it's also where can I skill myself up and make myself the most competitive possible resource in a global marketplace. So I think it just depends what level of analysis we're thinking about when it comes to students.
Globalization affects our societies in so many ways, and education is just one of them. Arguably, globalization is part of what has led to disproportionate opportunity being concentrated in larger metropolitan areas. Those larger metropolitan areas are the more globalized, sort of global, they're the boundary spanners of, where there's more of these global businesses, global industries concentrated. And so if we, one of the questions that came from an incoming MSBA student is raising whether we expect that, that there might be sort of a COVID-19 decrease in urbanization, which has certainly been on the increase for decades now, and it's just extraordinary how much urbanization has grown. Might we see a stepping back on urbanization and kind of the links to globalization that go along with that?
So that's a really interesting question. And, this is sort of, I guess, a little bit of an aside, not specifically related to globalization. But I was reading some work from a sociologist friend of mine the other day who pointed out that when suburbs were first created, suburbs actually were created in part to get people away from sicknesses that occurred in the cities. That part of the reason suburbs were created was because I can't remember the gentleman's name who was largely attributed with having created the suburbs, but it was outside of London. And the idea was to get more green spaces because there was tuberculosis going around in the city, there was cholera. And so if we believe that density, like living in a city, drives sort of the contagiousness or the transmission of coronavirus, there could be something to that hypothesis that in a post-coronavirus world, people will not want to, or will have a desire to live away from cities again. I don't think, it all depends how long this episode lasts. I don't think that will happen, but that is one potential extreme outcome if this crisis persists for longer than we expect.
If I jump in on that, I think it's important that we don't overplay the role of globalization in these kinds of patterns, such as urbanization, inequality, and so on, and to remember that the vast majority of the economic activity that's happening around the world is domestic, and that's especially true in a large country like the United States. The US actually, among advanced economies, ranks last on imports relative to GDP. If we look globally, still only about 3% of people live outside of the countries where they're born. So sometimes there's a bit of a temptation to think, okay, globalization is a really big trend. It's driving a lot of these other developments, but it's important, I think, to also be looking at the numbers and to recognize that most of what's happening internally within countries is still domestically driven.
Okay, one of the things that that's a very important and useful reminder. But one of the things that Rob ends, at the end in your final slide, you were kind of talking about political activity as being one of the drivers of how the reshaping of globalization is likely to emerge. And we've definitely seen that the U.S. relationship with China, you even highlighted that, in November, we'll know a lot more about what globalization will look like in an acknowledgement of the political relationships. And I think we've got a few questions that are asking about how might we've certainly seen relationships across nations be strengthened or in many cases tested in response to this crisis. And I wonder if you see it potentially reshaping the structure of these global supply chains and the structure of globalization going forward, if you see there being potential winners and losers. So, for example, we've got a question about, do we see a shift from China to India or other kinds of changes? Is it driven by political activity? Is it driven by other activities? Who are going to be the winners kind of coming out of this?
So I saw that question, the question about, do you see supply chains shifting from China to India in a post-coronavirus world? And my answer is actually no. Not because supply chains won't shift, but if anything, if they do shift, my expectation would be that not that they shift from China to India, but that they shift from China to other countries like Vietnam or South Korea or to other locations in Asia. Because when you think about India, India hasn't always been incredibly foreign investment friendly. There's a lot of local protectionism already inbuilt into the Indian system. Beyond that, part of the problem with India is it doesn't really have the infrastructure in place to support the kinds of global supply chains that large multinational organizations require. So I wouldn't see a shift from China to India. If anything, I would see a shift from China to Vietnam, let's say, as an example, and with some redundancy and reshoring, et cetera. So that would be my expectations. Steve, I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, I think that's likely. And distance also matters quite a lot in terms of, we see a lot of regional supply chains, a lot of regional trade. And so proximity, China is still going to be a very important base. And you have kind of the East Asian system there that will continue to be important, even if its geography changes.
And, with respect to the political question, I think we'll know more on November 4th, right? At least insofar as the United States is concerned, we'll have a better sense for whether these nationalist populist movements here in the United States will continue to grow. And I think that if Trump wins in November, that signals an increasing in protectionism and nationalism. If Biden wins in November, my expectation is that globalization will revert back to something that looks like what the pre-COVID pandemic era looked like, but at a lower level, not sort of at the peaks that we experienced in 2016, 2017.
It is really ironic that for the first time, arguably, the whole world is in the same boat. We're all dealing with the exact same threat and have so much potentially to learn from one another. And this is a moment where instead of that collaboration happening, we are seeing all the activity happening at the national level. I guess I'm kind of wondering whether you see multinationals playing a role in a shift away from that putting up the borders. What would drive that shift? Would it be academics? Would it be multinationals? Like, where do you see it? It feels like from the outside, the thing that would that would bring us together, psychologically, one of the things that brings people together is having a common enemy, having a common challenge, and a sense of common fate. And we have that in the world right now in a way far beyond what we've ever had before, but that's not what we're seeing as the response. And I'm just wondering if you foresee that changing, and and who would be the players that might enable that change?
From the standpoint of multinationals, I think multinational firms do have a constructive role to play here. And I think to the extent that we're seeing that there's a lot that continues to work in terms of the international supply chains and the extent to which companies have managed to keep the flows of goods going. And part of that is coordinated through through multinational firms. And so they have been making a contribution. I think they can continue to make important contributions as entities that can work across these different divides. I think it's also important, however, to keep in mind, the internal stresses that this crisis puts on multinationals. From a management perspective, not only are they suffering from the fact that they can't move people back and forth to have in-person contact like they had before, but they're also you also have internally the same kind of politics that plays out, the stresses between countries happening at the same time that they're facing greater business stress. So multinationals can play a very constructive role. They can help harness capabilities that are located across different countries, but we need to also recognize the internal stresses that places on them managerially.
I agree. I think that multinationals do stand to play an important role in the COVID crisis, precisely because, as Steve mentioned, they do have a presence in so many jurisdictions that they can keep a pulse on what's going on the ground. They can share information with those who might not be aware of what's happening in different locations. But there are myriad ways in which multinationals can help be part of the solution to the difficulty that we're facing during COVID-19. But one thing that I would like to stress, and you mentioned this as well, Batia, is this notion of policy coordination. Is that right? The COVID pandemic, it does not discriminate by country. It doesn't, it's at some level, it's a human problem. It's a common enemy that we all face. It's not a US problem. It's not a Spain problem or an Italy problem or a Brazil problem. It's a world problem. And so I was heartened that last week, Singapore convened a group of countries that pledged to work in a coordinated manner and share information with respect to coronavirus. One thing that I did notice was that the United States was conspicuously absent from that group. And so, it's interesting because, again, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this during the presentation, is that globalization tends to be one of the first boogeymans and one of the first things that is blamed for bad outcomes, whether it's economic or public health. But here is an opportunity for us to galvanize and to coalesce around a common enemy. But from a policy perspective, we're missing that opportunity.
So we have a question here that's really interesting. And unfortunately, it seems like at best we'll change that in November. But we have a different question in a different direction, is sort of thinking about your emphasis on how information flows were a key driver of globalization recently, that was really where you were seeing a lot of the increase. You were also seeing it in people flows, but the information flows was the most impressive. Rob's example is sort of how maybe there is going to be some information flows, particularly in resolving this crisis, though maybe the US is going to be left out of that. But I guess, does that suggest that the benefits of the next era of globalization will be realized more by the more skilled or the less skilled workers?
I think there's a great deal of uncertainty. I wish I could provide a clear answer. So up until, let's say, about 3 or 4 years ago, we were clearly seeing international information flows strongly outpacing the growth of domestic information flows, driving that upward trajectory. We've seen a big slowing of that in recent years, and so we don't yet know the key drivers of that. So part of it is a big increase in the growth of domestic information flows, all of what's happening with the trends in digitization. We're also seeing, on the other hand, data localization policies being embraced in a variety of countries. So there's a lot of this background activity going on in the world of information flows. And I think, I wish I could give you a clear answer, but it's really quite uncertain where that's going to play out.
And then if I come back, what was the second portion of the question again? It had to do with
winners and losers.
Oh, the winners and losers, right. So if you think about the traditional winners and losers have been, if you look at the data over the last 20 or 30 years, up until this point, the winners and losers have been high-skilled labor in developed countries, high-skilled labor in developing countries, and to a lesser extent, low-skilled labor in developing countries. And so the question is to the extent that we believe that populism and nationalism will increase as a trend, then you will see that there will be a decline in the high-skilled winners in developed countries, and likely a decline in the low-skilled winners in developing countries. That would be my expectation. But again, that's predicated on increasing nationalism, increasing populism versus a trend toward the reverse.
Right, which would be driven by the factors that you mentioned in your last slide, those right. that you kind of listed. So here's another question that's coming from an incoming MBA student, and basically it is interesting. It's kind of highlighting, many people have observed that it feels like COVID-19 is today's kind of global crisis that we all share, and that climate change arguably is sort of going to be very similar. We could be in the situation in terms of climate change that we are right now, where we realize, wow, by the time we've woken up, it's too late to do anything. And the interesting thing is that there's a connection between these two crises, because the decline in economic activity has allowed us to see just how much the climate has changed and to restore, sort of repair some of the damage as the economic activity has gone down. And so I guess the question is, what do you think will happen? You also brought up oil prices going down, which might have very perverse effects, potentially setting back climate change efforts. And so I wonder what you think about, and this question is kind of addressing, what do we think is going to happen in terms of climate change and sustainability on a global level, and how will that play into our recovery?
Oof, that's an existential question. I think so. Yes, I mean, you're right. I mean, what we've observed with the decline in economic activity throughout this pandemic is we've seen a reduction in carbon emissions, we've seen a reduction in pollution levels. But the question is what does that mean for sustainability and climate change mitigation moving forward? I'm not a sustainability expert, so I feel a little bit out of my comfort zone here. The thing that I would say, and I think Martina asked this question, I would say, Martina, for your generation, this is the existential question, right? And it's your generation that will determine in which direction we go. One of the things that we've learned through this pandemic is how important coordinated policy is. One of the things I've learned is how important coordinated policy is, and not just with respect to the coronavirus pandemic. Financial crises require coordinated policy, and I also believe that that climate change and sustainability will require coordinated policy. Is there the political institutional will for that? I don't know right now, and I'm not expert enough to wade into that discussion. But Steve, I'll defer to you if you have anything you wanted to add on that.
I would just again look at it as a powerful illustration of the value of cooperation and how important it would be to try as we can to rebuild some of these bridges between countries.
Thank you both so much for really a wide-ranging discussion, and you recognize that this issue of globalization really tees off so many other connected issues, and I really appreciate you bringing this insight to us in this series. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.